January 1945, Western Germany. Snow lay pressed into the mud outside a captured field hospital, its white surface already broken by boot prints and stretcher tracks. The guns had fallen quiet, but only briefly. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, blood, and damp wool uniforms that had not been dry in weeks. Surgical lamps hummed faintly, powered by a generator that coughed more than it ran. American medics moved with practiced economy. Their faces showed exhaustion rather than triumph. On the other side of the operating room stood German medical staff, doctors and nurses taken prisoner hours earlier, their insignia removed, their fate uncertain. They were not armed. They had not resisted. Their hands, however, still knew their work. What happened next defied expectation. Under the supervision of U.S. Army surgeons, the German doctors were instructed to scrub in. Instruments were passed across national lines without ceremony. No speeches were made. No orders were barked, only nods. For the wounded on the tables, uniforms no longer mattered. Arteries bled the same. Shock followed the same rules. Death waited patiently, indifferent to language or ideology. This moment did not emerge from sentiment. It came from necessity, law, and a shared understanding older than the war itself, an understanding shaped by what had led the world to this room. By January 1945, the war in Western Europe had entered its final grinding phase. The Allied advance that began with the Normandy landings in June 1944 had pushed steadily eastward, breaking through France, crossing Belgium, and pressing against the western borders of Germany itself. Cities lay in ruins. Roads were choked with refugees, retreating units, and the wounded. The German military, once defined by rapid movement and centralized command, now fought in fragments. The Ardennes offensive, launched in December 1944, had temporarily slowed the Allied advance, but it did not reverse it. When the fighting subsided in mid-January, German losses were severe. Entire divisions had been shattered. Fuel and ammunition shortages crippled mobility. Medical services, already strained beyond capacity, were overwhelmed by frostbite cases, shrapnel wounds, and untreated infections. German field hospitals were collapsing along with the front lines. Many had been abandoned during rapid retreats. Others were captured intact, still filled with wounded soldiers and medical staff who had chosen to stay. According to standing orders and the Geneva Convention of 1929, medical personnel were not considered combatants. They were to be respected, protected, and, under certain circumstances, permitted to continue their work. The United States Army Medical Department entered this phase of the war with a clear doctrine. Treatment priority was based on medical need, not nationality. This principle had been reinforced through hard experience in North Africa, Italy, and France. American medics had treated German prisoners before, often under fire, often with limited supplies. What changed in early 1945 was scale. Casualty numbers surged as fighting intensified near the German border. Evacuation routes were strained. Surgical units operated continuously, sometimes for days without rest. Antibiotics, such as penicillin, were increasingly available but still rationed. Blood plasma was precious. Every trained pair of hands mattered. Captured German doctors represented a contradiction. They belonged to an enemy army responsible for a war of aggression. Yet many had sworn the same medical oaths as their Allied counterparts. Their training was real. Their experience was extensive. In captured hospitals, American commanders faced a decision shaped not by ideology, but by survival. Orders issued from Allied headquarters emphasized compliance with international law. Medical neutrality was not optional. It was operational doctrine. Reports from the front indicate that U.S. medical officers were authorized to retain enemy medical personnel to care for the wounded, provided they worked under Allied supervision. This was not an act of trust. It was a controlled necessity. In many cases, German medical staff expected internment, interrogation, or removal. Instead, they were told to remain at their stations. The hospital would keep running. The wounded would keep arriving, and the war would not pause to resolve moral discomfort. As these policies took shape on paper, they soon encountered reality inside operating rooms where the limits of capacity were already being reached. The legal framework guiding these decisions had been written long before the war reached this stage. The Geneva Convention of 1929 explicitly protected medical personnel, facilities, and transports. Doctors and nurses, even when captured, were not to be treated as ordinary prisoners of war. They could be retained temporarily to care for the wounded, then repatriated when conditions allowed. In theory, this was clear. In practice, it depended on discipline, oversight, and the will to uphold restraint in the midst of destruction. The U.S. Army took this framework seriously, in part because it had seen the consequences when it was ignored. Early in the war, reports from Eastern Europe and the Soviet front revealed what happened when medical neutrality collapsed. Hospitals became targets. Doctors disappeared. The wounded were left behind. American planners understood that preserving medical order was not only a moral obligation, it was a stabilizing force in chaos. By late 1944, Allied medical services had become highly organized. Evacuation chains stretched from frontline aid stations to field hospitals, evacuation hospitals, and general hospitals far behind the lines. Each link depended on time, transport, and trained staff. When any part failed, mortality rates rose sharply. In areas where the front shifted rapidly, captured hospitals were often the only facilities immediately available. German medical units, despite the overall collapse of the Wehrmacht, remained relatively well-trained. Pre-war Germany had maintained a strong medical education system, and many army surgeons had years of experience. However, they were operating under extreme scarcity. Anesthesia supplies were low. Sterilization equipment was damaged or improvised. Records were incomplete or destroyed during retreats. When American forces took control of these facilities, they faced practical choices. Evacuating every wounded enemy soldier was impossible. Replacing entire staffs would take time the wounded did not have. In such circumstances, U.S. medical officers were authorized to keep German doctors and nurses in place, working under American direction, using Allied supplies where available. This arrangement was not without tension. German medical personnel were closely supervised. Their movements were restricted. Armed guards remained present. Yet inside the operating rooms, the focus narrowed to anatomy, procedure, and survival. Surgical protocols, while not identical, were compatible enough to allow cooperation. Contemporary U.S. Army medical reports describe these environments as quiet, disciplined, and intensely focused. There were no joint briefings, no discussions of the war beyond what was necessary to coordinate care. Communication was functional. Gestures, shared terminology, written notes. The urgency of trauma erased many barriers. For American surgeons, the decision to allow enemy doctors to operate was rooted in responsibility. Every surgeon understood the limits of endurance. Fatigue led to mistakes. Mistakes cost lives. If trained personnel were present, not using them would be a failure of duty. For German medical staff, the experience was disorienting. They were accustomed to strict hierarchy and ideological oversight. Now, they operated under the authority of the enemy, guided by procedures that emphasized neutrality rather than command loyalty. Yet the rules of medicine remained familiar. This convergence, law, necessity, and shared professional identity created the conditions for moments that surprised those who witnessed them. It was not reconciliation. It was coexistence under pressure, unfolding one operation at a time. These conditions would soon be tested more directly, as the human, tactical, and moral dimensions of the situation became impossible to separate. Inside the hospital, nationality dissolved under exhaustion. Surgeons worked with sleeves rolled high, hands reddened by repeated scrubbing. Nurses moved between tables without pause, tracking pulse rates and blood loss, with quiet precision. The wounded, American, German, and civilian, often lay side by side, separated only by the urgency of their injuries. For German medical staff, the psychological weight was immense. They were no longer shielded by command structures or ideological certainty. Their authority came only from competence. Every incision made under Allied supervision carried both professional responsibility and personal risk. Mistakes would not be excused. Yet successful operations earned a different kind of acknowledgement. Brief nods, continued trust, permission to keep working. American medical personnel were trained to suppress personal emotion. Still, reports indicate moments of visible strain. Many had lost friends in recent fighting. Allowing enemy surgeons to work required discipline, not empathy. The focus remained on the patient, not the uniform. This restraint was learned, not instinctive. The wounded themselves often drifted in and out of consciousness, unaware of who operated on them. Morphine dulled pain, not fear. Survival depended on speed, cleanliness, and skill. In that space, medicine functioned as a shared language. No speeches were needed. This human convergence did not erase hostility. It contained it, and containment in total war was a form of control. Angle 2. The tactical reality. From a tactical standpoint, medical efficiency directly affected combat readiness. Wounded soldiers who survived could be interrogated, exchanged, or removed from the battlefield. Those who died created logistical and moral burdens. Commanders understood that chaos in medical services rippled outward. Captured hospitals offered immediate infrastructure. Operating rooms, wards, and supply rooms, however damaged, were preferable to improvisation in barns or tents. Retaining German medical staff accelerated stabilization. It reduced evacuation delays. It preserved Allied surgical teams from collapse due to exhaustion. American medical officers reported that allowing German surgeons to operate under supervision increased throughput during peak casualty periods. This was not humanitarian improvisation. It was calculated efficiency within legal bounds. By maintaining order in captured medical facilities, Allied forces also projected control. The message was clear. The war would be fought to the end, but not without structure. Even in defeat, systems remained intact where possible. This tactical clarity reinforced the decision to cooperate, even as emotional resistance lingered. Angle 3. Leadership and command judgment. Such decisions were not made by individual surgeons alone. Authority flowed from senior medical officers and field commanders who understood both international law and operational necessity. Clear directives reduced hesitation at lower levels. American leadership emphasized discipline over retribution. Medical units were reminded that violations of the Geneva Convention undermined Allied credibility. Maintaining standards mattered, especially as victory approached. In practice, this meant trust, but controlled trust. German medical staff were monitored. Supplies were rationed. Authority remained firmly Allied. Yet within those boundaries, professional autonomy was permitted. This balance, firm oversight combined with functional freedom, set the conditions for what followed. As fighting continued and casualties mounted, the system would face moments where its limits were tested further. Those moments would reveal additional layers of complexity, from technology to morality. For German medical personnel, the final months of the war dismantled long-held certainties. The structures that once governed their work, clear chains of command, supply allocations, ideological supervision, had eroded. In their place stood immediacy, wounded men arriving faster than they could be treated, equipment failing, evacuation routes cut off. German military medicine had emphasized discipline and efficiency, but it was also shaped by political intrusion. By 1945, many doctors found themselves working without oversight from party officials or military police. Under American control, ideological pressure vanished. What remained was professional identity. Surviving German medical reports and post-war testimonies indicate that many surgeons viewed continued work as an obligation independent of the regime. The opportunity to operate, despite captivity, was unexpected. It reaffirmed a version of medical ethics that predated the war. Not all embraced it equally, but refusal was rare. Skill was their currency, and competence their protection. This was not absolution. It was function. The hospital became a space where collapse slowed, even as the war outside accelerated toward its end. Angle 5. Technology and medical practice. By 1945, battlefield surgery had evolved rapidly. The widespread use of penicillin reduced infection rates dramatically. Blood plasma transfusions stabilized shock victims. Mobile surgical hospitals allowed intervention closer to the front than ever before. American and German surgical practices differed in emphasis, but the fundamentals were shared. Amputations followed similar principles. Debridement techniques were comparable. Anesthesia methods, often ether or spinal, required precision regardless of uniform. In shared operating rooms, procedures became standardized under Allied protocols. German surgeons adapted quickly. Their familiarity with trauma care allowed seamless integration. Instruments passed hand to hand. Time became the only enemy. Technology did not eliminate mortality, but it narrowed the margin between life and death. Every trained operator increased survival odds. This practical truth outweighed political division. Angle 6. The moral boundary. Allowing enemy surgeons to operate raised questions beyond efficiency. Could neutrality survive in a war defined by ideology? The American answer was procedural rather than philosophical. Medical duty was framed as separate from combat duty. The wounded were patients first. This separation preserved moral clarity within chaos. It also reinforced Allied identity as lawful and restrained. The hospital did not become a space of forgiveness. It became a space of limits. On violence, on vengeance, on collapse. In that restraint lay strength. As winter turned toward spring, these principles would be tested during moments of peak pressure, when decisions carried irreversible weight. Those moments marked the turning point of this quiet, overlooked chapter of the war. February 1945 brought a surge that strained every system still standing. As Allied forces crossed the Roer River and pushed deeper into Western Germany, resistance hardened briefly, then fractured. Artillery duels flared near towns and river crossings. Short, violent engagements produced waves of casualties in hours rather than days. Wounded men arrived faster than evacuation convoys could move them. In several captured hospitals across the Rhineland, operating rooms ran continuously. Records from U.S. Army Medical Department units note surgical teams working in rotating shifts, sometimes 20 hours at a stretch. Fatigue became measurable. Tremors in hands, delayed decisions, narrowing margins. It was during one of these peaks that the informal policy became explicit practice. American senior surgeons authorized German medical staff not merely to assist, but to lead procedures under observation. This shift was subtle, almost administrative. A name was written on an operating slate. A German surgeon was assigned primary responsibility. An American officer remained present, overseeing supplies, anesthesia, and post-operative care. The room did not change. The stakes did. This decision was driven by necessity, but it carried symbolic weight. Authority inside the operating theater was momentarily redefined, not by rank or nationality, but by capability. The chain of command remained intact, yet professional autonomy expanded. U.S. reports describe no incidents of refusal or sabotage. German surgeons worked methodically, aware that every action was observed. Their precision was noted. Complications were addressed without dispute. When operations succeeded, the ward filled with survivors who otherwise would not have lived. Outside, the war continued with unrelenting force. Inside, time slowed to the rhythm of pulse and breath. This turning point did not announce itself. It revealed itself through outcomes, through stabilized patients, reduced mortality, and the quiet recognition that cooperation, under strict control, was functioning. As the days passed, the implications of this decision grew heavier, setting the stage for moments that would test trust, oversight, and endurance to their limits. By early March 1945, the pattern had solidified. In captured medical facilities across Western Germany, cooperation between American and German medical staff was no longer improvised. It was structured. Operating schedules were coordinated. Supply usage was logged. German surgeons operated under Allied supervision with increasing regularity, particularly during mass casualty influxes. One documented case from U.S. Army medical reports describes a field hospital overwhelmed after a prolonged artillery exchange near the Rhine crossings. Evacuation vehicles were delayed by damaged roads and enemy fire. Inside the hospital, triage decisions became severe. Surgeons prioritized those who could be saved quickly. Others were stabilized and held, or given palliative care. In that environment, German surgeons performed complex trauma operations, abdominal wounds, vascular repairs, amputations necessitated by infection or blast damage. American officers monitored each stage. No ideological discussions occurred. The work was relentless, technical, and silent. The psychological impact was evident, but contained. American medical staff acknowledged the effectiveness of the arrangement in after-action reports, noting increased surgical throughput and reduced fatigue-related errors. German staff, though still prisoners, were treated as professionals within the operating room. Outside it, guards remained. Authority was never ambiguous. This coexistence did not extend beyond necessity. It did not suggest reconciliation. It demonstrated boundaries, how far cooperation could go without compromising control. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine later in March, the scale of casualties intensified once more. Hospitals shifted locations. Some were dismantled and moved forward. Others were left behind as new fronts opened. The moment of turning had passed. The decision to allow enemy surgeons to operate freely, within defined limits, had proven its worth. The war moved on, indifferent to the ethical weight carried by those rooms. Yet the consequences of that choice would not end with the last operation. They would surface in reports, policies, and memories as the war reached its conclusion. Those consequences unfolded in the aftermath that followed victory. When organized resistance in Western Germany collapsed in April 1945, the tempo inside military hospitals changed abruptly. The steady flow of mass casualties slowed. Surgical schedules shortened. For the first time in months, exhaustion gave way to assessment. American medical units began compiling formal reports. Survival rates, infection trends, and procedural outcomes were reviewed. In facilities where German surgeons had been retained and permitted to operate, outcomes were notably stable during peak casualty periods. These findings were recorded without commentary. The numbers spoke for themselves. German medical personnel were gradually reclassified. Some were transferred to POW camps with medical responsibilities. Others remained temporarily in place until wounded populations could be evacuated. According to U.S. Army Medical Department summaries, the conduct of German medical staff during captivity was largely compliant and professional. There were no widespread disciplinary actions related to medical cooperation, no recorded sabotage, no significant breaches of protocol. This absence of incident reinforced the validity of the decision made months earlier. For American surgeons and nurses, the end of the fighting brought delayed psychological impact. The strain of continuous operations, compounded by moral restraint, surfaced only afterward. Letters and post-war interviews reflect exhaustion rather than reflection. Many simply wanted to leave hospitals behind. The hospitals themselves bore the marks of use. Floors stained beyond cleaning. Equipment worn thin. Improvised repairs everywhere. They stood as evidence of sustained effort rather than triumph. As Allied command structures transitioned from combat to occupation, policies governing medical personnel shifted again. German doctors were screened for political involvement. Some were later employed in civilian medical roles under Allied oversight, particularly as public health crises emerged among displaced populations. The war had ended, but its injuries had not. Medical systems, American and German, were now entangled in reconstruction rather than destruction. This transition exposed deeper consequences that extended beyond immediate outcomes, reaching into post-war ethics and international standards. In the months following Germany's surrender in May 1945, the implications of Allied medical policy became clearer. Hospitals, both temporary and permanent, faced the dual challenges of caring for remaining wounded and managing displaced civilians. German medical staff, once enemies in uniform, were integrated into these operations under strict supervision. Their expertise proved indispensable. Without them, mortality rates among wounded and sick would have risen sharply. Official reports from the U.S. Army Medical Department highlight measurable impacts. Mortality in field hospitals that retained German surgeons was approximately 10–15% lower than in comparable facilities without them, a significant figure considering the severe injuries treated. Complications from shock, infection, and delayed intervention were reduced. These outcomes were not a matter of ideology. They were empirical, derived from consistent practice. The experience also influenced post-war medical ethics. Military and civilian authorities recognized that professional duty could, under extreme conditions, supersede political allegiance. Historians later noted that this approach foreshadowed broader post-war efforts to reconcile former enemies in medical and scientific fields. Medical neutrality, though tested by total war, had survived and even demonstrated practical advantages. For the German medical staff, the aftermath was uneven. Some returned to civilian hospitals under Allied oversight. Others faced denazification tribunals, where professional competence often weighed in their favor. Those who had proven reliable in treating all wounded without discrimination were sometimes permitted to continue their careers, albeit under watchful supervision. American surgeons, reflecting on the period, emphasized that the decision to allow German doctors to operate freely was a calculated risk that had paid off. It demonstrated that adherence to professional and legal principles could yield tangible results, even in a theater dominated by chaos, ideology, and destruction. At a human level, the hospitals became places of constrained but functional coexistence. In these rooms, the war's divisions blurred temporarily, subordinated to the immutable demands of life and death. Yet outside the operating theaters, the world remained scarred, streets lay in rubble, and millions were displaced. The delicate balance between law, necessity, and human skill had succeeded in one domain. But the larger devastation persisted. The final reflection on this chapter, calm and grounded, underscores both the moral and practical lessons embedded in these decisions. In the quiet aftermath of battle, the operating rooms of Western Germany stood as anomalies, spaces where war's relentless ideology gave way to the immutable rules of medicine. Here, uniforms mattered less than skill, nationality less than knowledge, and ideology less than the pulse of a human life. For a brief, intense period, captured German surgeons and American medical personnel shared a single purpose: to preserve life in the face of chaos. This convergence was neither sentimental nor symbolic. It was pragmatic, rooted in law, necessity, and professional duty. Yet it revealed something deeper about the nature of humanity in total war. Even amid destruction, humans can adhere to principles that transcend politics and enmity. Neutrality, once a legal concept, became operational reality. Cooperation emerged not from trust, but from shared responsibility. The consequences echoed beyond the wards. Survival rates improved, wounded soldiers returned to life, and the American approach to medical neutrality solidified as both an ethical and tactical imperative. German surgeons, once instruments of a collapsing war machine, found their expertise recognized and utilized, a quiet testament to professional identity, enduring through catastrophe. History records these rooms not with fanfare, but in reports, statistics, and survivor testimony. The story is subtle, almost invisible, amid grand narratives of tanks, artillery, and surrender. Yet within it lies a lesson. Even in war's darkest hours, discipline, support, and human skill can carve out sanctuaries of order, life, and restraint. It is a reminder that the measure of civilization is often tested where survival demands the highest precision, and where saving one life may, quietly, reaffirm the humanity of all.